Beyond the Gates spoilers reveal that Vanessa still believes Joey had nothing to do with her husband's death. The teasing is both a sedative and a stamp, a phrase everyone repeats at brunch and meetings, a mantra meant to soothe the community anxious to the rumor mill, but also a spark that ignites a fire. Vanessa hears it in every glance, every whispered apology from neighbors who once dined at her table. She wants to believe it, because believing it is easier than admitting the truth, which has dug itself out like worms after a storm. Yet the story she tells herself is complicated. It's wrapped in the scent of Doug's aftershave on a pillow he no longer wears, the hollow circle of a house where laughter once moved like light in the air, and the private foundation of betrayal she has endured alone. Doug's death had been written off, publicly, as an accident. The car had left the road on a rain-slicked night, twisted into metal and memory. But grief does not always abide the neat corners of accident and fate. There are fractures where one might expect a straight line, and once those fractures appear, they reveal the jagged architecture of something deliberate. The community conversation about an accident shifted quickly to murmured suspicion. Small details, ordinary at first, refused to lay down. In those small things, Vanessa found the pattern of a lie. She noticed a scuff on Doug's driving gloves she did not recall. She noticed the quiet way Joey avoided naming the details when he came by with casseroles and condolences. She noticed too the way Joey's hand never quite left her back when he hugged her, how his voice could go very low and very close. Her confrontation with him happened the way many confrontations do, in the fog where dignity and desperation collide. She had overheard him on the phone 2 nights earlier, a muted exchange caught just beyond the doorway where she had meant to listen for only a moment and ended up listening for an hour. His words, though muffled, were clear enough in their intent. He spoke in clipped sentences about making sure there wouldn't be any loose ends, about timing and insurance. He laughed once, a sound that fell like a thrown stone in her chest. She did what any woman who has loved a man who'd been taken from her would not want to do. She followed the sound to its source. She asked him, later, in the kitchen, while the kettle was still hot and their hands curled around mugs that kept steam but did not keep secrets. "Can you promise me you had nothing to do with Doug?" The question was simple, but it carried a lifetime. Joey met the question with something close to a smile. The kind of smile that tells you it is holding something back. "I can promise you that," he said, easy as butter. He lied so neatly that she almost believed him then. She wanted to. But belief requires a ledger and memory requires accounting, and the ledger had begun to list debts she could not pay. There is a particular kind of confession that is not a confession at all, the admission that is bartered like a coin, traded for silence. When Vanessa pressed him harder, when she told him about the voice on the phone, his face showed, for the first time, something like pity. "You're imagining things," he said, and then, when she would not let him off with an explanation, he became disarmingly candid. "You're the only one who knows where I was that night," he told her softly. "You can't go to anyone. You were with me. You have no alibi. You could be the one they look at." His confession was not of killing Doug so much as a manipulation, the ownership of her vulnerability like a chain. When he admitted to her that he had been involved, when he acknowledged the role of his own hands in bending the arc of that fatal night, he did it with a chilling lack of remorse. His face, in the lamplight, had the pale, animal focus of a man who consumes threats like food. "I didn't plan to hurt anyone else," he said, in one breath that tried to make the universe small and manageable, "but accidents happen." When she named the most terrible possibility, that Doug had died because of him, his reply was not a denial, it was a calm, corporate sorting of risk. "You can tell," he said. "But I'll tell them about you, about us, about the money. Will your children understand their mother slept with the man who killed their father? Will anyone in this town look at you with anything but disgust?" It was not only a threat, it was an equation in which Vanessa would lose even if she survived. This was the most insidious part, control that arrived soft-footed, wearing the clothes of protection. Joey framed himself as the only person who could keep her safe from suspicion, from poverty, from exposure. He talked in terms of futures and what other people would say, of reputations smothered by scandal. "You don't have to tell," he murmured, "and if you don't, nobody gets hurt. If you do, everything burns." He painted 2 roads in front of her, one where she stayed and kept silent and one where she tried to walk away and burned. But the roads were not equal. The path that led to silence was lined with the amenities of comfort. The other path was raw, open, unpredictable, and therefore dangerous. Which is easier, to give up your honesty or to give up your life? There was also the matter of the night itself. He insisted he was with her when the accident happened, an alibi that she had once thought might protect him and now feared would chain her to him. The truth was primed to be used against her. If she tried to go to the police, they might read the timeline herding them to the same conclusion: opportunity and motive. Doug had life insurance. The sums were not paltry. Vanessa had been his spouse, his heir. If someone wanted it to appear as though Vanessa had a reason, they had paved this road. The idea that her own devotion could be weaponized against her was a cruelty she had not anticipated before. If there had been any romantic justification for her liaison with Joey, it had long since caved under the weight of grief. Their affair began as consolation and became entanglement, as affairs often do, one person needing to be noticed, the other needing to be the one to notice. But the mantle of passion cannot withstand the grit of criminality. As Joey admitted what he had done or allowed, Vanessa felt the architecture of her life rearrange, fitting into a new, darker blueprint. Outside the private tragedies, the public world ticked on. The gated community where they lived, where the lawns were trimmed with ritualistic care and the parties were curated like glossy magazine spreads, thrummed with gossip like a city of wasps. People said the right things at funerals. They posted the right condolences on social media. They made thin jokes about midlife decisions in group chats that were then forwarded and endlessly annotated. Vanessa's face, composure and tact, became a kind of artifact for people to study and muse over. The very visibility she had once prized became an impediment to her actions. It was as if living under social scrutiny made her hands too visible to do anything secretive. Then Nicole saw them. It happened at a fundraiser thrown under the vaulted ceilings of the community center, an event where bread was broken and signatures were exchanged for polite causes. Nicole was supposed to be donating a large check in Doug's memory, a gesture meant to affirm that the community would stand by Vanessa through grief. Instead, she saw Vanessa and Joey in a corner, huddled, not with the careful distance of mere acquaintances but close, bodies speaking the language of intimacy. Nicole saw Joey's hand slide over Vanessa's waist, the small possessive gesture that co-opts someone's freedom in a single motion. She saw Vanessa tuck her face into his jacket and hold him like someone clutching a lifeline. Nicole had no context for the words they had exchanged hours earlier, Evelyn's hushed transcript being the only raw material of the town's rumor mill. All she had was the image. For someone like Nicole, who lived by the public eye and whose own reputation had been polished by years of careful choices, the sight registered as a collision between betrayal and performance. Attraction between two people is rarely scandal in itself, but in a town where story is the currency, where every relationship has been catalogued, the sight of Vanessa in Joey's arms became a kind of public indictment. Nicole could have looked away. Instead, something in her froze, and the photograph of that moment imprinted itself into her mind. The rumor machine churned with more efficiency than Vanessa could have predicted. Photos taken by well-meaning attendees surfaced on group threads, a casual snap that captured Joey's hand mid-hug. Vanessa's eyes turned away, the angle managing to be both unflattering and damning. Beyond the Gates spoilers tease that someone wrote under one image with the smug certainty of someone sure of the next chapter's plot. The town began to whisper that Vanessa had been sleeping with her husband's supposed killer. They began to wonder whether the grief was a performance. Joey's threat hung over her like a cloud that had decided not to rain but to cast a permanent shadow. He said that he could paint her in any color. He said he could move pieces to make the picture he needed. There was the other element too. The money. Joey had not been simply a friend, he had become an access point to schemes that were darker than the community's daylight gloss. From whispers on the street to the distant chime of boring court docket news, there were threads that suggested Joey's fingers dipped into money laundering and small-time financial crimes that would not survive scrutiny. Vanessa had, at times, been a passive accomplice, signing documents, not reading the fine print, trusting a man whose life had a shadow that was always cooling his edges. The first weeks after Doug's death were a lesson in what the law sees and what the heart knows. Detectives asked questions with the zeal of professionals who knew the usual arcs of grief and the more unusual arcs of calculated harm. A forensics report could not quiet backyard conversations. A coroner's note could not quiet the way Vanessa's children stared at her over dinner like strangers. The town recited the word routine at the chapel and the detective's office. Routine in a place like this meant a cover for things inconvenient to polite life. There was a moment, late at night, when Vanessa sat with the kids and told them a version of the truth. She left out the parts about Joey's confession and gave them a story that was digestible. Their father gone, a life to rebuild. The children accepted it the way children often do, with a temporary peace that will loop back later in other forms. Vanessa's guilt did not leave the room. It moved like fog, thin at first and then, imperceptibly, gathering into walls. She knew she needed to act, but act was a dangerous word. The wrong movement could cause the whole scaffolding of their lives to collapse. Control, it seemed, was Joey's first language. He had learned to narrate reality so often that it had become comfortable terrain for him. "Don't make a mistake," he told Vanessa once. He promised gifts of safety, an alibi held in reserve, a story that might drown out other versions. He treated her not so much as a companion as a ledger, inputs and outputs that could be adjusted as necessary. His manipulation was not always crude. He used shame the way an artisan uses a fine tool. If she were to come forward, he said, the town would not look kindly upon a woman who had betrayed her marriage. The children would be handed a narrative that recast them as beneficiaries of a crime. There were so many ways for them to be hurt that his threats bled into a kind of rationale: stay and survive. Vanessa's mind, though tangled, was not entirely without strategy. She began to make lists. Small ones at first. She catalogued the nights she had been with Joey and the nights she had not. She wrote down every time someone had looked at her as if she were broken and every time someone had said, "He's in a better place." She scrawled questions on legal pads and crossed them out. These lists became maps of potential moves, the kind of careful thinking that comes not from courage alone but from the desperate arithmetic of someone who has everything to lose. What she did not have was proof. A confession whispered in a kitchen does not survive the light of a police interrogation chamber. Joey's alibi that they had been together was both a prison and an insulation. Without tangible evidence, her word might be read as the word of a woman entangled in an illicit affair. She considered going to the police. The decision haunted her the way a door we never open haunts us. If she went, she risked being seen as the woman who traded comfort for luxury and then failed at honesty. She risked being charged as a co-conspirator or as the prime suspect. She risked losing custody of her children, losing the town's goodwill, losing everything. If she stayed, she risked living under a man's thumb who had shown he would shape the world to his needs. There was no obvious moral answer. There was no clean path back to the life she'd had. Only the road ahead, obscured and dangerous, spread before her. And then the evidence she had prayed for found its way to her, not in a tidy envelope but in the half-gloss of a photograph left by a stranger. A neighbor had taken a snapshot on the night of the accident. A shaky phone image captured from across the street. In the dim light, the silhouette of a figure could be seen standing near the shoulder of the road, the figure too close to the place a car would later tumble. It could have been anyone. The photograph could have been garbage. It could have been a piece in a puzzle that refused to fit. But when Vanessa looked at it, her breath caught. There was something in the curve of the head that reminded her of the way Joey tilted his face when he spoke in the softer tones that held regrets like currency. Her hands shook as she held the print. It was small. It could be dismissed. It could also be the first brick in a case against a man who had made the architecture of her life into a trap. There were always other pieces, phone records that could be subpoenaed, a gas station camera that might have recorded the route of the car, a neighbor who had sworn he'd heard the car's engine racing late that night. The law has a way of making the private world public, of prying open doors people thought were locked forever. Vanessa started to imagine a path less about confession and more about evidence. If she could gather proof without exposing herself to the social death Joey threatened, she might retain some bargaining power. She started to think of recording him, of catching his voice and his sin on a device that could not forget. But people like Joey are not reckless, they are careful, and care often breeds prediction. The more Vanessa considered her options, the more she observed his patterns, the way he left the house for short periods, the way he checked his phone as if he expected messages from the world's more dangerous men. He had enemies, yes, but he also had alliances. He had ways of making people look at the wrong things while he did the right ones. If Vanessa slipped, if she moved clumsily, he would notice. He would, she believed, cut off any path she might take toward the light. Fear is a teacher that shortens our sight and makes our options look like cliffs. She started to understand that to beat the kind of man who could rewrite evidence and cast shadows, she would need cunning rather than confession. The community's breath was held. If Joey's manipulation was a slow boil, the town was a pot waiting to simmer. People took sides like they take sides at sporting events, adopting narratives because narratives are how one navigates the lives of others. Vanessa's options shrank as the circle tightened. The only person whose eyes she trusted less than Joey's was her own reflection in the mirror. She was left, in the hush between dusk and dawn, with a decision that would define not only her fate but the model of motherhood she would leave her children. To fight would be to risk everything, to submit would be to weather a life shaped by a man who had no hesitation about telling her which truth to live by. The night closed, and she could not see the road ahead. She only felt the pulse of fear at the base of her skull and the stubborn bloom of a hope that somewhere, evidence would align in such a way that she could reclaim her story. She did not sleep that night. She listened for the sound of Joey's car and the steps at the back door. She wrote questions in her head, rehearsed confessions that were also strategies. She imagined standing in the detective's office with the photograph clutched in her hand and the recording on her phone, then imagined the other, more likely scenario where she stood in the same place and the detective looked at her with a face that had pity on it and asked about motive. She thought of Doug's laugh and of how the house still smelled faintly of his cologne. She thought of her children and the way their small hands fit into hers as if they were a promise. In the morning, the town woke to a whisper that would not die. Someone had seen Vanessa and Joey close at the fundraiser. The rumor thread thickened like pile-up on a roadway. It would be used by some as proof of motive, by others as confirmation of the worst gossip. She knew, then, that time was not on her side. Either the truth would be wrenched out like a tooth, machinery grinding and painful, or she would have to sharpen her own instruments and use them in secret. She chose, for the moment, to keep her head down and her plans in shadow. She would move, she decided, like a woman who knows the house is on fire and walks with a bucket to the well rather than stand outside pounding on the door. She would collect. She would wait. She would not, she told herself, be her own executioner by revealing a lover's sin before she had a better blade with which to fight. Yet even that decision to wait and collect, to not act out of panic, was a form of action that put her on a moving track. The more she delayed, the more opportunities for Joey to entrench himself, to alter narratives, to make the law speak the language he wanted it to speak. The photograph in her hand felt like a live coal. She kept it in her glove compartment, as if keeping it close would mean she could not be surprised by what might happen next. That night, as she folded laundry with one hand and read an email about school with the other, her phone buzzed with an anonymous message. You should be careful. People who know too much end up like Doug. She looked over her shoulder, as if someone might be standing there. The house answered with the sound of a radiator cooling. She put the phone down and swallowed the bile of fear and knew, in a bone-deep way, that the world she had thought she could navigate with small compromises had become a place where every choice required a ledger. The ledger was long, and the pen had been passed to her. She was, whether she liked it or not, a player now. The rules were not one she had chosen, but they were the rules that would determine whether she survived. The day she decided to act not from courage but from the sharpened necessity of a mother would come, but not yet. For now, she folded and refolded the map of small moves she might make, circling the places where she could find proof and marking those that were traps. She taught herself to listen without being noticed, to leave a room with a smile and an earful of other people's words. She found, in the small articulations of daily life, A way to be invisible and present at once. She began to think like someone who needed not only evidence but also allies. There were people who would believe her if the evidence was strong. There were people who would never forgive her. The question was the same as any: who would take her side when the night deepened and the gates swung closed? She began to see the town as a stage and the players as actors who had practiced for roles they had not been given. Joey's performance of concern, Nicole's polished shock, the detective's sterile calm, all were parts to be studied and, if possible, exploited. Vanessa would need allies she could not yet name. She would need a recorder that could not be dismissed, a photograph that could not be explained away, a witness who could place Joey at the scene in a way the law could not ignore. She would need courage measured in long increments and a willingness to be more cunning than the man who had taught her, through fear and manipulation, how to obey. The next move, unknown and dangerous, would be hers to make, and its consequences would ripple outward, altering friendships, marriages, and the face of a community that had, until now, believed itself impermeable to darkness.